In this lesson, we'll start to work with Maya's attribute editor. Okay, so just like we did previously, we'll start with a scene file for this lesson 9. So we'll grab this 09 begin, open this up, and we're going to use pretty much the exact same scene file that we used in our previous lesson, and we're going to use this to talk about the attribute editor in Maya. Now, the attribute editor is something that is going to encompass almost every aspect of Maya, whether you're getting into modeling, animation, rigging. So the attribute editor is something that you are going to have to become really familiar with. So to get to this attribute editor, you can do this in a couple of different ways. You should be able to see an attribute editor tab over here on the right hand side of your interface. So you could always click on the attribute editor over here. The method I prefer to use, though, is to just use the keyboard shortcut Control A. Just remember A for attributes. So Control A, you can see that will toggle us back and forth between the channel box, which we talked about in our previous lesson, and the attribute editor. Now at the moment the attribute editor is blank. It won't show anything until you actually have something selected. So let's say I grab this green tube piece of geometry, and the attribute editor really contains almost anything that is being controlled or has anything to do with this surface. So we have things like the shape node for this piece of geometry, and you can see here's the actual piece of geometry itself, which is right over here. And we have the shape node. So when it comes to working with any piece of geometry in Maya, really we have two different, what you could call nodes that make up any piece of geometry. One is the transform node. Now the transform node is pretty much what we see whenever we get into the channel box. So the transform node is what contains information about where this object sits in 3D space. In addition to the shape node, we also have, or in addition to this transform node, we also have the shape node. Now the shape node really contains all of the information that's required to render or display that piece of geometry. How smooth this object is, how this object is going to render out, how that object is going to be displayed. All of these things can be found inside the object's shape node. Now, in addition to these two nodes, we also can access the material of any object that we have selected through this attribute editor. So this is where we can come in and start to change the material name if we want this to be named something very specific. We can change the material type that this is using, material color, access really anything that has, again, anything to do with this surface. Again, as we start to progress a little bit further through this training, you're going to start to see this attribute editor quite a bit. So it does look fairly daunting at first, and as you start to make more changes to your geometry, you'll start to see all of those operations start to appear as new tabs within this attribute editor. So this thing can start to get pretty full. And again, it looks a little bit daunting at first, but once you sort of understand where you need to be looking, these things will start to make a little bit more sense. And again, we'll be talking about this area pretty extensively as we start to get a little bit further along in this training. Now, when it comes to working with an object, anytime you have an object selected, that's where we can start to get to its attributes. The problem, though, is that there may be some instances where you want to try to work with a piece of geometry and you don't want its wireframe selection getting in the way. So let's say I wanted to be able to work on this orange tube piece of geometry, and I want to be able to change its material. So I get over here into the orange material, and now I can start to work on that. But the problem is, I may not necessarily want to be able to see this wireframe in the way. Now the problem is, if I deselect this object, you can see it's no longer loaded up here in the attribute editor. So to get around this, what we could do is turn on this feature, or rather disable this feature called Auto Load Selected Attributes. So what this means is by default, whenever this is turned on, the attribute editor will automatically load up whatever we have selected. Now by turning this feature off, you can see now that Auto Load Selected Attributes has been disabled. And now you can see as I come in and start to select objects and change my selection, this attribute editor stays locked to whatever I had open. Now sometimes this can be a nice thing because now I can have something I want deselected, and I can come in and start to work and change the material, maybe the tessellation, which we'll talk about in some of our later lessons. But now I can start to work here with maybe a little bit more freedom compared to what I was able to before. It really just depends on your particular needs, though. Now, if I wanted to get to another object at this point, we could do this in a couple of different ways. One would be to just simply press Control A to get out of my attribute editor, and then Control A once again to jump back into it, and that will force it to load back up with whatever we have selected. Another option is to select a piece of geometry and then just choose this Load Attributes button. That'll force it to refresh and update itself with whatever we currently have selected. But for the most part, you will probably want to leave this auto load selected features or selected attributes probably turned on. Now another thing that we can do is to come in here and actually leave ourselves notes. So this notes area is something that will probably be visible to you by default. If you want this out of the way, you can always just grab this little divider, pull that down, and sort of collapse that out of the way. And really you can leave notes for any of these nodes. So if I want to go over to, let's say, something like this orange material, we could leave ourselves a note that says, let's say, do not change this material. And then that way we know for either ourselves for later reference or for anyone else who comes along to work on this scene later, they know that, okay, this is something that I'm not supposed to change. Or again, these nodes can be completely unique for any of these nodes that we find. So for working in a team environment or for working on your own, if you need to leave yourself notes or anything for later, this does become really, really nice. One last thing that I want to show you is the fact that we can rip this attribute editor off in a couple of different ways from this main window. So at the moment, you can see that this attribute editor is docked. But if we wanted to, we could just simply grab that attribute editor, grab it, and just simply pull it out as a free-floating window. And now we can have independent access to the attribute editor and this channel box at the same time, which is sometimes useful. And what you'll notice now is the next time we close this and press Control A once again, the attribute editor remains in this free-floating window. We could always take that, drag this back over here to the channel box, and redock that if we wanted to. And now as I press Control A, it remains back in this docked state. Another thing that we can do is actually have a couple of different attribute editors open at the same time. So let's say for whatever reason I needed to be able to see some attributes for both of these objects at the same time. Well, I could take the attribute editor for this green material and click on this Copy tab. You can see that will rip this off into a free-floating window, but it still leaves another version of this attribute editor docked over here. Now at this point, I could come and click on another object and get to the attributes for this object. But still, it keeps the original object that I had selected whenever I clicked on this Copy tab loaded over here. So now this becomes useful if there is maybe attributes that we need to be able to cross-check between a couple of different objects or a couple of different materials, or if we, for example, wanted to sample this color, we could choose something like our eyedropper tool and come in and now sample colors between these different materials and so on and so forth. So it does become sort of a useful little thing to have sometimes two different attribute editors open at the same time. Again, once you're done, just close that out and you should be good to go. Alright, so that's a look at how we can start to kind of mess with and get, at least on a very basic level, familiar with some of the different features and some of the different functions found inside of this attribute editor.